To begin a discussion of price and value, I'm going to return to the scholastics theory of just price introduced earlier. According to the scholastics, a just price has two sides. It must cover the cost of the producer to make the sale item, or more temporally accurate, allow him to make another, and it must account for the need on the side of the buyer. Notice the asterisk. Aquinas called this the double rule of just price. There's some specifics to consider. If the first condition isn't met, the seller would stop producing the good. A seller can be indemnified, meaning protected from loss, from unusually high production costs by raising the price of a good. This exchange must be based on free bargaining, which requires informed consent by both parties and the absence of coercion through unequal economic power or situational duress. There's that asterisk again. Exchange needs to be voluntary contracting and protected against what the scholastics called conditional consent, which means the consent on the part of the buyer was conditioned on some external factor. If the seller needed to charge more because his costs of production increased, he was free to do so. However, if the buyer's situation was such that their need for the product increased, the seller could not charge more to take advantage of the increased buyer's need. We'll come back to the justification for this in a minute. Monopolies created conditional consent situations, but so did other external forces that created a situational need greater than a normal need, such as illness or weather. In order for price to be just, it must be the result of a truly free bargaining. But how to determine an ordinary need such that it's distinguishable from an extraordinary need? The notion of common need represents the need for a good in the absence of any coercion, and prevents the exploitation by force of singular circumstances. This common need isn't predetermined, but arises over the course of consecutive market exchanges. Thus we see in the scholastics theory of just price the essential of the supply meets demand analysis, but with strict qualifications. This double rule is rooted in a sophisticated concept of ownership. Property ownership is usually seen as a bundle of various rights, sometimes referred to as the bundle of sticks, permitting the owner to use, restrict access, enjoy, consume, or dispose of property to various degrees. The scholastics considered ownership of not only physical, but also of intellectual, spiritual, or soul qualities in exchange. A seller cannot raise the price of a good due to an extraordinary circumstance which increases the buyer's need for the good, because then the seller would be selling something that did not belong to him, the buyer's situational need. The buyer owns that need, not the seller. The same logic applies to the scholastic considerations of usury, which can be illuminating, though we aren't specifically speaking of borrowing debt and interest now. A lender has extrinsic title to interest in terms of foregone gains, which is the profit that he would have made from the money if he had used it himself. The lender has no claim, however, on the utility or profit derived from the money by the borrower. In the latter case, the lender is selling something he does not own, which is the borrower's industry. Essentially, you can't sell something you don't own. So how does this thinking of price relate to complexity economics? Price is an emergent phenomenon, dependent on social considerations such as norms and values, institutional considerations such as market structures and property rights, and is path-dependent on both the seller and buyer histories. It's an aspect of social exchange, a corollary of the social production we've been talking about for the last several weeks. I advertised that this segment would also include value. I tend to agree with Joan Robinson that value is metaphysical, and price is simply an incarnation of value at a particular time. In this way of thinking, when a buyer and seller make an exchange, they are actually exchanging values, whether good for good or money for a good. Thus, price and value are often interchangeable, but the assumption that an item has an intrinsic value in an economic sense, but not related to exchange price, is difficult to parse in its subjectivity. This makes modern usage of the term value, such as a labor theory of value, where value is defined by the quantity of labor employed in making a good, or the value-add method of computing GDP, unhelpful. I'm sure you'll find people who disagree with this perspective.